cheers of the people all along the route were sure evidence of his popularity as he drove swiftly towards Poets' Corner at the Abbey.
I remember my mother getting all the jewellery out of the bank and then it getting stolen during the night, most of it, which was a disaster.
I, Philip.
I, Philip.
Take thee, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary.
Take thee, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary.
To my wedded wife.
To my wedded wife.
To have and to hold.
To have and to hold.
Following the King and Queen in the procession were Queen Mary, Princess Andrew of Greece, the bridegroom's mother, and King Haakon of Norway. Then
the wedding was the first extravagant public display after the war, bringing together shattered royal families from across Europe and reminding the British of a more lavish time they'd almost forgotten.
And how they cheered the happy pair when they came out onto the balcony. What a wonderful picture the princess made, looking most lovely in her magnificent gown and standing happily beside her husband.
Even the cakes stood like a long line of exotic Eastern pagodas. These are private wedding films taken for the Queen on one of the happiest days of her life. Still a princess, she was about to live one of the most obsessively recorded lives of anyone on the planet. The minute she steps outside, every smile, every turn of the head, every wave, dutifully filmed. Here they head off for their honeymoon in exotic Hampshire, escorted by cavalry trained for almost everything except confetti. A year later, more home movies shown here for the first time. A baby boy, heir to the throne. But this is film of a kind we haven't seen before. It's an off-duty Elizabeth, unguarded, playful, almost normal. But really, there's nothing normal about her. The weekend pad is, after all, Windsor Castle, built on a site chosen by William the Conqueror. It's been continuously occupied by the monarchy for 1,000 years. Some kind of haven from cameras, much preferred to Buckingham Palace. And it was here on her 45th wedding anniversary that disaster struck in 1992.
It was a November day, darkish, it was drizzly, and I can remember well being in the forecourt with the Queen, watching these huge flames coming out of the castle, which was immensely distressing. I equally recall how extraordinarily stoic the Queen was throughout that appalling sight.
She'd spent much of her life at Windsor. I think for anyone to see such a massive fire in what is your home must have been very tough for her.
It was caused in the most humdrum possible way, a light setting fire to a curtain. But it came at the end of a year which had shaken the monarchy and the Queen herself like no other. By early 1992, 2 of her children's marriages had ended, and by the end of that year, her eldest son and heir's marriage had reached unprecedented heights of recrimination.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
And so, in the aftermath of the fire, that annus horribilis, it wasn't only Windsor Castle that needed to rise from the ashes. The monarchy looked battered, and the question was increasingly asked, who was going to pay for the damage? And, by the way, why did the Queen, one of the richest women in the world, not pay income tax?
On the question of the Queen paying for the restoration of Windsor Castle, it was, in fact, I think, at the end costing of the order of £37 million. But there was no way that the Queen had that sort of money available to do that.
It's always been a sore point about the finances of the monarchy, and they've been adjusted from time to time to bring them up the position up to date. The Windsor fire just sort of underlined the sensitivity and the difficulty of all that.
There was a huge amount of publicity about that at the time. I just have to say it was complete and utter nonsense, utterly and totally wrong. We had been discussing with the Queen at her request, not the government's request, whether she should pay tax since early in 1991.
Well, pay tax she did. But hard-pressed to find the money to repair the castle, the royal family then did something which was financially essential, but also useful as a symbol of changed times. They opened the doors to the world and they sold tickets.
By opening Buckingham Palace, we were able to find a source of revenue which managed to pay for 3/4 of the cost of the restoration. And the balance of money we actually found from savings that we made in the costs of managing the other occupied palaces.
The 1990s also saw the final scenes in the confrontation between Diana and the rest of the royal family. Plonked in a traditional setting, she'd struggled with the crushing weight of tradition and wide-eyed, impossible expectation.
Listen to this welcome. And what an extraordinary moment for the new Princess of Wales to look out on this sea of human beings who now will feel that they in some way own her.
And they did own her. After her wedding day, Diana changed into a new kind of royal icon, a woman who was wounded, impulsive, open, above all emotional, searching out victims and declaring before the world her own victimhood.
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
Reaching out, she found places and people the Queen and her son could not. She was declared Queen of Hearts, installed by television and the papers as the rebel monarch of Britain's new therapy culture.
It wasn't a comfortable period. There was a very difficult, obviously personal situation, but the Princess of Wales had established almost an alternative court, and handling the tensions, the diary clashes, the publicity and the press attention was difficult. The Princess of Wales's interview on Panorama took place very shortly after I arrived at Buckingham Palace, and the fallout from that was unpleasant and difficult.
Where the Queen believed in suppressing her own feelings, in stoicism, dry understatement, Diana represented the absolute opposite of all that. The breakup of her 11-year marriage to Charles seemed symbolic of wider divides in the country, cultural, generational, something touching the very meaning of being British in modern times.
In retrospect, one of the most embarrassing events in all royal history, and there have been many embarrassing events in 1500 years, must be the wedding of Charles and Diana. Having piled the expectations up as high as the flowers and as long as Diana's train, the sense of disappointment when it all fell to bits.
In the 4 years before they divorced, a demeaning and humiliating war of words began. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. As the Queen looked on, questions were asked which had never been openly voiced before. Had she been a poor mother? Had Charles been bullied into marriage? More generally, was the conventional monarchy now simply out of date? And then came the real car crash.
Just after midnight, the black Mercedes hit the curb, cannoned into a concrete pillar of an underpass, then bounced into the side wall.
Concussion, a broken arm, lacerations to the thigh shouldn't give enormous cause for concern.
Stephen, I have to interrupt there. because within the last few moments, the Press Association in Britain, citing unnamed British sources, has reported that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died.
Everything came to a sudden head. Much of Britain, not all of Britain, was convulsed in grief, publicly displayed grief, an almost Mediterranean outpouring of grief, a million miles from the traditions of buttoned lips the Queen had been brought up with.
I've never known the nation to be in such spiritual turmoil as that week.
For 4 days after Diana's death, the Queen stayed with her grandsons at Balmoral as public anger grew.
I think probably what was somewhat startling, and something for which the whole royal family were unprepared, was the sort of insistence on public grief, which is not something that most people are asked to provide.
I was inside Buckingham Palace the afternoon that the Queen came back from Balmoral. There was a very ugly atmosphere in the crowd that was lining the Mall, and as her car came down Constitution Hill, you could suddenly hear a ripple of applause from the crowd.
This is a tragic
occasion. It looks as though the Queen is about to, she's getting out of the car, Wes, and is going to talk to people.
It's extremely unusual. This is almost unprecedented. I think perhaps the last time that the Queen was among her people outside the palace was the day the war in Europe ended.
The fact that she had come back, it was all right. It wasn't completely over with, but you could feel the atmosphere change.
You've been queuing a long time.
And I can remember the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh spending a long time talking about what the mood was and what was in people's minds, and wanting to understand, but not quite being able to just be out there and mingle and hear as private individuals.
On the 5th day after the princess's death, the Queen finally addressed the nation in a live broadcast. In her so familiar voice, she said something difficult and unfamiliar, a generous admission of Diana's power.
What I say to you now, as your Queen and as a grandmother, I say from my heart. First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness.
She's not an actor. She is what she is. She behaves as she does, and what you see is what you get. There's no putting on of a face in order to be more popular, because it just wouldn't work.
I know how much it cost her to have said those words, but she said them so gracefully.
6 days after her death, Diana's funeral took place at Westminster Abbey. And as the coffin passed, the Queen paid her respect in a way she had never been seen to do before.
I was standing quite closely behind her as the funeral procession came along, and I recall that she bowed. I wouldn't describe it as nodding her head. She actually bowed. It was completely unexpected. I don't think there'd been any discussion of it, certainly not with her advisors beforehand, but instinctively she'd done it, and it was the right thing to do, and it was a wonderful gesture. I guess that the royal family and their advisors learnt a very harsh lesson that week, that you have to communicate grief, you have to communicate sorrow, and you have to recognise that when you're the royal family, other people are feeling that grief. It isn't just a private thing.